Good afternoon and welcome to our Gnoseologies event. My name is Giovanna Parmigiani and I'm the host of this series organized within the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative at the CSWR at Harvard Divinity School. As some of you might know, this series focuses on ways of knowing that are often labeled as non-rational. Traditionally referred to as gnosis in Western philosophical and religious traditions, and often understood in contraposition to science, these ways of knowing are becoming more and more influential in contemporary societies, popular culture, and academic research. What is this place of spirit possession, divination, and experiences perceived as out of the ordinary in our lives? How can we study and approach this type of phenomena? Going beyond dichotomies such as body and mind, ordinary and extraordinary, reason and experience, and matter and spirit, this series hosts scholars of different disciplines and practitioners interested in exploring and expanding the boundaries of what counts as knowledge today. Before introducing today's guest, one announcement: the Q&A feature here of Zoom is activated. You can type your questions for our guests at any time, and I will try to bring them into the conversation as time permits. Please don't be shy. The best events are always those in which we all participate. If you have questions for us after the event, you can reach out to me by email, and I will find your email in the chat box here, and I will share them with today's guest. So today's guest is with immense pleasure that today I introduce you Professor Tim Rudbøg. Tim is Associate Professor in the Study of Religions at the University of Copenhagen, where he also serves as Head of Education for the Study of Religions and directs the Copenhagen Centre for the Study of Theosophy and Esotericism. He is active in several international scholarly networks dedicated to the study of esotericism and religion, and has published widely on these topics. Among this recent work are the co-edited volumes Imagining the East, The Early Theosophical Society, Innovation in Esotericism from the Renaissance to the Present, Esotericism Deviance, and the Academic Study of Western Esotericism, Foundational Theories and Methods. Today, Professor Rudbøg will help us explore esoteric identities and philosophical legitimacy through the figure of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Through detailed intertextual analysis, he argues that Blavatsky actively engaged with philosophical discourse, developing perspectives on being, consciousness, space, and time in conversation with thinkers such as Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Spencer. While Blavatsky regarded her work as philosophical, her conception of authentic philosophy diverged from many contemporaries. Tim suggests that while esoteric identities are now often neatly labeled, Blavatsky deserves recognition as a philosopher in her own right, while simultaneously exceeding that category. So thank you, Tim, for being here. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Giovanna. It's an immense pleasure to be here with you. And as we discussed, I will give a presentation and talk. So I'll just share my slide here with you, and I hope you all can see it. And so as you mentioned, the primary title is Esoteric Identities, and Helena Blavatsky will be a case study, you can say, of this question of esoteric identities, and also the question about women and philosophy and the history of philosophy. So first of all, here's an overview of what I would like to talk about. First, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Philosophical Society or Helena Blavatsky, I'll just give some background information to set the stage, you can say, give the context. Then I will come to my argument in this talk, which we of course can discuss together, and then focus on some of the problems with the history of philosophy and the study of esotericism in terms of identities. And then come finally to the question whether Blavatsky has anything to do with philosophy or even can be regarded as a woman philosopher in her own right. So that's the overview, point by point. And for those of you who are more interested in this topic and this discussion, you can look at this book, the Oxford Handbook of American and British Women Philosophers. in which I have an article which my talk is based on. So just to give some context, in the 19th century, spirituality became something that began to emerge as a term, as a word, and gained immense popularity. We see, for example, the spiritualist movement beginning in the 1840s, 48, maybe with the Fox sisters. The idea that you can communicate with loved dead ones, that there might be an existence after this life, after the death of the body, and that there is some bridge between this world, the physical world, and the spiritual world. This whole idea became very popular. It's not because this idea hadn't existed before, but certain practices, as many of you know, with mediumship and sitting around a table trying to communicate with your dead uncle or something like that, that became really popular. But the spiritual movement entertained this idea also that in order to do extraordinary things, you had to be maybe possessed by a spirit. It would be a spirit that would take possession of your body, it would communicate with the surrounding people and so forth. And you would be, as a medium, perhaps more passive and let the spirit work through your body. And sometimes this could also lead to phenomena like levitation or making tables and chairs very heavy or very light, and other so-called extraordinary or paranormal phenomena might occur. Sometimes the spiritualist movement even set up like theaters and stages for displaying this kind of thing. And there were a lot of people who were interested in this, and some of those people were also Helena Blavatsky and H.S. Olcott and many others who gathered in New York. I'll come back to Helena Blavatsky, who was born in the Russian Empire at the time, but also someone like H.S. Olcott, who was a colonel. He had the task in the Civil War to kind of investigate corruption, for example, in the state. He was also working as a lawyer in New York. He wrote about spiritualism in the newspapers and many others. So they gathered together and thought this whole idea about something spiritual versus this kind of idea of a more material universe is very interesting. But in contradiction to the spiritualist movement, they were also interested in the history of, you could say, occultism, magic, and all these things. They didn't just see it as a new phenomenon. They were also interested in the whole history of this idea. And they also began to cultivate this idea that maybe self-development and not being so passive is important. Maybe being an occultist is about being able to actually cultivate yourself in such a way, cultivate your will, your imagination, that you can do the phenomena, and that maybe you can, even if you deal with spirits, you can do it more in kind of a relationship than being possessed. And this slowly around that time, around 1875, began to emerge as an idea, and it was quickly associated with occultism. And this is also the time where occultism as an ism is born. In French, it was with Eliphas Lévy, the extensive priest, magician who wrote in French. But Blavatsky and others formulated the term in English and tried to distinguish that term from the spiritualist movement. So it was very much about also being passive or active. And they decided to found a society, and they would sit and look in a dictionary, Webster's dictionary at the time. What should we call this society? And they landed on Theosophy, or the Philosophical Society. And the term Theosophy is a Greek word. It means divine wisdom or wisdom of divine things. In the Philosophical Society, it especially means divine wisdom. So this idea that there is a universal wisdom that in some way is beyond all particular religions, but in a way behind all religious traditions and philosophical traditions, like a perennial, universal source of knowledge and wisdom. So that became the society. The society, of course, it started out with this focus and interest in occultism and paranormal phenomena, but and they held like meetings in New York, almost in like a salon fashion in Blavatsky's apartment, where it would gain a lot of interest. But soon also, Blavatsky and Alcott became more and more interested in what took place in Asia, in India, Ceylon, for example, discussions between Christian missionaries and Buddhists and Hindus. And they also had this idea that India probably is the cradle of civilization. It's where the original source of wisdom in our time comes from, the Vedas and so forth. So they would actually leave New York and go to India. And not long after that, they would set up headquarters in India, um, and in Adya. And there is still a headquarter there. Later on, the Philosophical Society, already in the 1890s, split. So there are multiple societies today. But the building, the major headquarter from back in the day, is still there in Adya in India. And slowly, this would gain momentum. You could argue that the Philosophical Society became the first public social occultist movement. So, contrary to Freemasonry, for example, where you become a member, a secret brother, and you undergo initiation, here you could like join the society and you would sit down and have readings and go to lectures and discussions, very much like the spiritual communities are today. So this kind of open, and it was also one of the very early global societies, going to India, but also further to China, Japan, but also the US, all around the world almost, very quickly. And many of the core ideas that were cultivated have become mainstream today in spirituality. Even the distinction between religion and spirituality was early on cultivated by the Philosophical Society, that you can be of whatever religion you like, but spirituality is the main thing, and you can be spiritual without being a part of any religion, and that almost in a kind of a secular age become more popular, as we all know. People are more in many places around the world more confident saying that I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, or I don't belong to religion. And that has become a popular stream. Blavatsky, of course, also claimed to have contact with Mahatmas and this kind of secret brotherhood of spiritually evolved gurus. Um, I will come back to that. And the Philosophical Society is very known for popularizing karma and reincarnation, that concepts that were known from Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, in the rest of the world. So they played a major role there. Helena Blavatsky,
Something, sorry to interrupt you, but I could during the slides. This
yeah,
Gabrielle
you're welcome.
asked if the stamp pictured in the previous slide was really used for mail or more of a commemorative item.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this became their motto. There is no religion higher than truth. So they very much emphasized that all people could belong to whatever religion they want to, or they belong to from tradition, but they could still be a member of the Philosophical Society, because the Philosophical Society would cultivate all religions and the commonalities, and there would be an emphasis on almost comparative studies. And this is
But
a
was it
stamp.
used for post or for mail or just commemorative?
Yeah, this is commemorative. This is from 1975, marking the 100-year anniversary of the birth of the Philosophical Society. Also because the Philosophical Society has played a major role in India and also Ceylon or Sri Lanka, in terms of reviving traditions. Later on, Annie Besant would also, who was the second president of the society, play a major role in the independence movement leading up to Gandhi, and then furthermore to independence. So the Philosophical Society has had an influence in India that is significant, you could say. And you will
Thank you
also
so
find statues of Blavatsky and Alcott, and there are streets named after them, and the central train station in Sri Lanka has statues of them on top, and so forth. There is still, like, you could say, a marked influence.
Thank you so much. We'll have the questions about later.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So Helena Blavatsky, she became the corresponding secretary of the society, but of course she was a major influence on the society and all the core ideas that were developed into society. She was, you could say, the major writer, the major thinker of the society, publishing extensively major works like Isis Unveiled from 1877, but also The Secret Doctrine from 1888, that in many respects are original works, bringing forth ideas that had not really been put together in that way before, also mobilizing critiques of contemporary science and different religious traditions that had not been put together in that way before. And she wrote numerous articles. We're talking about, I would say, 10,000 pages plus from a very short period, actually, around 1873 to 1891. So she would write extensively during this period. And and also be the main formulator of what the word theosophy means, the whole cosmological outlook, the worldview, so to speak. Even though she never wanted to have a closed worldview like a dogmatism, it was always about comparing different traditions, looking for that unity in all religious traditions, philosophical traditions. And she was also on a kind of personal level, a very unusual woman, you could say. As a child, her family and other people claimed that they had witnessed her exercising paranormal phenomena. They would even be put on display in their home when she was a child. And she comes from also a royal family. There are princes and so forth in her background. And she was married to, you could say, Mr. Blavatsky, from whom she got the name. But just a few months after the marriage, when she was 17 years, moving into 18 years, she ran away basically and began her travels all around the world, going to India, going to Egypt, going to the US, and claiming to have been in Tibet as well. With this idea that she wanted to find authentic spiritual gurus and masters, magicians who had a living tradition and learn from them. And later on, she would come to the US in 1873, and then, as the story goes, she would help found the Philosophical Society, and then became her like main focus point from there on until her death in London in 1891. So in the study of religions, often she has been compared to, in terms of influence, to Martin Luther with the Reformation, or Emperor Constantine with the formulation of Christianity as a state religion, in terms of her influence on the modern spiritual landscape, you can say. This also means that she is much known as an occultist, theosophist, and perhaps religious founder. And that's something I would like to discuss a little bit more in this talk, of course. Is that her identity, an occultist, a religious founder, or is there another dimension, or even several more dimensions to it than that? So this brings us to my argument, of course. So should Blavatsky be considered a woman philosopher in her own right and be placed in the history of philosophy? And some of the questions that can be raised, how can she be considered a philosopher? What is the proof of that? What does that even mean? Um, and you could also say there are some problems in a way, and we'll come back to that, why Blavatsky is not considered a part of the history of philosophy. Are there reasons for that also, when once we begin to unravel the what you might call the proof of what I'm arguing for? So let's first off look at uh, philosophical identities in the history of philosophy. So you could say, how do we go about this? If someone is to be considered to being a part of the history of philosophy, how do we go about that? One way is, of course, to look at all the works that have been written related to the history of philosophy. So this is the second category. And often when you go to a bookshop and you buy books on the history of philosophy, also popular books, but also more serious books, you will see that they often include the same 10 or 20 or 25 philosophers. You have Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard maybe, and you name it. It's very often the same 20 people that are there, and very often, of course, men, all of them. And you could question why has that particular selection been almost canonized? I mean, if you look at history, there are so many more people that have thought philosophically. So why them? Then you could say, oh, they are the most genius, maybe, or they're the most interesting. But still, every time we formulate some kind of almost canon, implicit or explicit, it's also there's a selection criteria. There's also power involved in the selection, bias maybe even. Who decides? Then you could say, okay, it's people who are trained in the discipline of philosophy, but that's also more a recent phenomena, that people are trained in the study of philosophy. That's only a few hundred years, or maybe a little bit more, depending on how you look at it in the modern way from the modern university. And so you could also say, okay, people who deal with religion or spirituality, they are not philosophers, so they should not be included. But I'll come back to that, if that holds up. And the other factor is, of course, if you actually read the history of philosophy, you will see that most historians do not agree on what selection criteria that should be used. So there's no like universal agreement about who should be included in the history of philosophy and who should not. Different historical works will argue in various ways, and this comes back to definitions, of course. What is philosophy? And if you, instead of going into the history of philosophy and the writing of the history of philosophy, go into, let's say, philosophers themselves, you will see, okay, Pythagoras, Plato, it's the love of wisdom. For someone like Hegel, maybe philosophy is like a system or the unfoldment of the spirit of freedom until it understands itself as absolute. Or you could take like a more modern example, Deleuze, for example, the act of formulating concepts. But so that means if we consider all the different philosophers throughout history, they will have like just as many definitions of what philosophy is. So there is no common definition. That means it must be a canon or a bias or a particular selection criteria that is in play. And that's, of course, problematic in itself. And I mean, the attempt as an historian must be to avoid those kinds of biases. So that I see that as my task, to try to not go into bias about selection criteria. Another method. And if we look at the history of philosophy, you also see it has been a long fight for the right to define. One of the most influential works in modern times is Brücker's extensive 5-volume Historia Critica Philosophiae, which famously excludes most of the domains we call esotericism today, and made an effort to do that. Also because there was a theological bias, you could say, for what is true philosophy. So that's one point. I will come back to that in my argument, of course. But another problem is, what about women? If we look at the entirety of the philosophy of history, women are very often excluded or not present in the history of philosophy. There are a few women that are present, but they are few in number, and there are reasons for that, of course. But since the 80s, a few works have, as I've listed here, definitely taken up the question and fought to introduce women into the history of philosophy, which is an important work. But none of them, until this current volume, which I mentioned, have included someone like Helena Blavatsky. So why was Blavatsky not included even in women histories of philosophy? That's also a question I'll come back to. So, but as Rogers and others write and argue, in the interest of not only enriching philosophy, but also providing a more comprehensive and accurate account of its development, we need to seek diversity and aim for inclusion. So maybe we should move beyond this kind of more restricted canon, because we want to have an accurate account, an accurate historical account that is including the diversity. I think that's important. And the problem is not necessarily because women are different, because I think that would be very essentialistic to argue women are different, so they are not philosophers by nature, and that has actually been an argument for several hundred years. But because their circumstances and their conditions have been different, and their means of communication or communicating philosophical ideas have been different and often worse. For a long time, women did not have access to education in the same sense, it was not usual to write in the same way as men. And that also means we need to take other source material into consideration. For example, letters, poetry, maybe even spiritual output, because not everybody necessarily wrote their philosophical ideas in the tradition of academic treatises. Another problem, often you could say, okay, Blavatsky, she's an occultist. She wrote about spiritual matters, so that automatically excludes her from the history of philosophy. That would also be what Bucer argued in his famous work, that all these different domains, rejected knowledge, so-called, they don't belong to the history of philosophy. It's not true knowledge, not true philosophy. But still, often we see actually several women that were very spiritually inclined have been included sometimes. Queen Christina of Sweden, for example, who was interested in esoteric topics. Hildegard of Bingen, central thinker, and also Christian tradition, Christian mystical tradition. Anne Conway, related to the Cambridge philosophers. Catherine of Siena, and also in the 20th century, Simone Weil. Have often been included as philosophers in these new accounts. But what is interesting is that they also all were involved in esotericism and spirituality. So that means actually there are women philosophers interested in esotericism that now are beginning to become part of the history of philosophy. Actually, there are also numerous male philosophers that were explicit Christians that wrote about both philosophy and spirituality, and they are regarded as core philosophers, like Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, whose higher level of knowledge actually begins to become faith and religion. And the leap of faith is very well known, that once you have reached the pinnacle of critical thinking, ethical thinking, you have to take the leap of faith. Or Thomas Aquinas, of course. So why not Blavatsky? Is it because there's something a bias against the occult, that if you're associated with the occult, you're not able to think philosophically in the traditional way? Or is it just reception history? Or is it that she was a woman? But another question, of course, is there even philosophy in her work? And that's something I will take a look at shortly. It could also just simply be a lack of knowledge, of course, not even a bias, but people don't know about Blavatsky. They have not read it. If they look her up in a dictionary, they will see that she often is classified as an occultist or even a fraud. So it might not be prejudice. It could also be neglect, simply. But nonetheless, the task of the historian must be to look at all the diversity, all the different types of people who have engaged in philosophy. And she was, of course, conscious that once she took on the word occultist, that I am an occultist, and she was one of the first to really do that. She very well knew that this was in contrast to established knowledge traditions. So it was almost like a countercultural move to do that, and argue very polemically for occultism. But it is interesting. I mean, if we look at identities, I think we have to remember also that people's identities are very complex. No one person is just one thing. We have all become aware that someone like Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists, he was even more of the time an alchemist and spent most of his time doing alchemy. Or John Dee, for example, the famous Elizabethan with Queen Elizabeth I, her astrological advisor, but he was also the major so-called scientist, geographer, navigator at the time. It was not just one identity, you could say. People can contain many things at the same time. But this is often lacking a little bit in the study of esotericism, this idea that people can be more things at the same time, that you can actually be religious, scientific, and esoteric at the same time. Because in many ways, many of the major definitions of esotericism and what it is has often been defined either as a particular way of thinking. So if you're an esotericist, you think in a particular way. This is something Antoine Fèvre, of course, formulated. It could also be Kogel von Stuckrad early on formulated that esotericism is like a discourse of higher knowledge, or as others have argued, it's like a polemical category that has been created by people who don't like it. So the only reason esotericism exists is because people have excluded it from knowledge domains. But this notion that esotericism is something particular kind of creates this problem that often people and even organizations are not singular. They include many different aspects and facets. There's like multiple identities, threads that have been woven together from numerous strands, you could say. So I think the challenge of the field is to sometimes think beyond the kind of more fixed categories or even systematic types of discourses and just simply embrace historical complexity, that people and traditions are more than one thing. And often when we try to categorize them into being one thing, then it's a question of power and legitimization. And historians should try to avoid this kind of approach, I think. And how do we avoid that approach? I would say the intertextual approach is quite useful because we could simply say, okay, if we look at texts and we read sources, what do we find in those sources? Did this person engage with philosophy? Is this person's text intertwined, interfiltered with philosophical texts from other people? Is the discussion related to philosophers, for example? So if we, for example, look at Blavatsky's text, do we find any trace in her text of the history of philosophy? Does the history of philosophy mean anything to her text, her idea, her argument? What about her discussion partners in the text? Are they philosophers? So you could say if there is no trace of philosophy in a person's text, of course, then maybe it doesn't belong to anything that relates to the history of philosophy. But if there actually is trace of philosophers, philosophical ideas, quotes, references, discussions, then maybe why should it not be seen as part of the larger philosophical discussion that has been ongoing for centuries? And this is famous, of course, from Umberto Eco, who also had this idea in a popular sense. Here, I realized that not infrequently books speak of books. It is as if they spoke amongst themselves. In the light of this reflection, the library seemed all the more disturbing to me. It was then the place of a long, centuries-long murmuring, an imperceptible dialogue between one parchment and another. So I would say Blavatsky's work, disregarding actually her almost, are infiltrated in the history of philosophy. And we clearly see this if we just look at her first work, major work, Eyes Unveiled from 1877. Already in the beginning of the work, she writes a lot about how she sees her own time as being a time of loss of knowledge, that knowledge is becoming more material, that it's only the senses that are in play, and that this is actually a degradation of philosophy rather than a progression. So philosophy is not really evolving, it's actually being degraded and being distorted from what it truly was once. And we also see that actually the name philosophy itself is mentioned over 300 times in the work. So there's like clear intertextual evidence that philosophy has a meaning in this work. And she often emphasizes that Plato, Platonism, Indian philosophy, Hermetic philosophy are the keys to restoring philosophy to its rightful spiritual domain. Because for Blavatsky, philosophy has lost its spiritual dimension and also the dimension of kind of a living practice. So she dislikes this idea of philosophy being almost positivist empirical science, and she dislikes this idea that philosophy is disconnected from a spiritual practice. Um, and you can see she writes here in Eyes Unveiled, but Plato could not accept a philosophy destitute of spiritual aspirations. So this becomes her main concern, that modern philosophy is actually not real philosophy because it has lost the spiritual element and this aspiration towards the eternal and the true state of being, almost Plato's ideas. Um, Also in her second major work, The Secret Doctrine, from 1888, which also is an attempt in terms of style to synthesize science, religion, and philosophy, because she thinks and feels that these domains have been more and more separated, and they should not be separated because only when they are unified you can get closer to real knowledge. Here also the term is used over 300 times, and she enters into discussions with numerous philosophers in this work, like Schelling, Hegel, Kant, Plato, Fichte, and so forth. And also many from the Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition and other traditions as well. And but even beyond that, she actually also um, tries to define concepts like being, consciousness, space, and time, and several other central terms that often have been associated with the discipline of philosophy. You could say philosophy has often been about epistemology and ontology, also ethics, trying to find out what is consciousness, what is true being, what is space, what is time, and this she does, and also in original ways. If you, for example, take a look at something like this, where she is trying to discuss what is being, non-being, or the absolute. She goes into deep discussions about this. She spends a lot of pages devoted to these discussions. You can see she writes the idea of eternal non-being, which is the one being, will appear a paradox to anyone who does not remember that we limit our ideas of being to our present consciousness of existence, making it a specific instead of a generic term. This sounds very philosophical to me, this kind of critical discussion of philosophy, of being, arguing here that we have to be careful because these terms are just terms, um, and that we have to remember that terms are limited, and they're also limited to our present state of consciousness, and that our consciousness is always conditioned, which means that can our human consciousness actually perceive absolute being if we are limited beings in a way, at least in our everyday consciousness? She continues, I've highlighted a little bit further down here, that in the absence of data to go upon and of faculties to comprehend such data, probably express that life as non-being, which is real being. So we can only understand real being according to how our own categories of understanding are formulated or constructed. So there is always this element of limited interpretation. In our case, the one being is the noumenon of all the noumena, which we know must underlie phenomena and give them whatever shadow of reality they possess, but which we have not the senses or the intellect to cognize at present. So consciousness is limited, but there is something beyond consciousness, almost similar to what Immanuel Kant would argue in terms of das Ding an sich, that it's difficult to comprehend the thing in itself because we have the aesthetic categories and the categories of the mind that construct reality. So you can see further on, this distinction between the absolute and thinking leads the reader naturally to the supreme spirit of Hegel and the German transcendentalists as a contrast that it may be useful to point out. And then she goes into long discussions with these German philosophers who were not that far apart in time from herself. And she argues that they actually don't have a completely correct understanding of the absolute principle, because for Blavatsky, the absolute cannot move. Where Hegel's concept of spirit is that there is like an unfoldment throughout world history, where spirit, universal spirit, comes to see itself in a movement and then folds back on itself. But for Blavatsky, the absolute principle can never move. It is absolute in the sense that it's eternal and cannot move anywhere and should not move anywhere, um, because that would be a limited process in space and time. She also has a take on consciousness. She says, for example, concrete consciousness cannot be predicated of abstract consciousness any more than the quality wet can be predicated of water, wetness being its own attribute and the cause of the wet quality in other things. Consciousness implies limitations and qualifications, something to be conscious of and someone to be conscious of it. So her definition of consciousness is actually that consciousness is a relation, it's a condition of duality. There is someone conscious, but there's always something to be conscious of. And this state of duality and relation is also a limited state of being, actually. She will later on go into how this duality is abolished in true knowing, but then we can't really speak of consciousness anymore because consciousness has become transcendent beyond the state of limited relation of the knower and known. She discusses what space is. She says it is without dimension in every sense, self-existent, neither limitless void nor conditioned fullness, but both. It was and ever will be. So space is the fundamental, and then there are objects in space, but you can't really say what space is. It's just that which always is there. And of course, she unfolds this in much more detail. The same also with time. She has her own take on what time is. She very much sees time as being an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration, and it does not exist where no consciousness exists. So for Blavatsky, there is only time when there is consciousness, and consciousness is limited. And for some reason, consciousness cuts reality into past, present, and future. But this is an illusion, and it is our perception of what we could call time. But in the real world beyond limited consciousness, dual consciousness, time also will vanish in the sense we understand it. But she also has this particular definition, which is very philosophical, about time being completely related to consciousness. So just to briefly pause a little bit, what I've hoped to have demonstrated in that part is that on the one hand, Blavatsky developed core concepts like consciousness, being, the absolute space, time that often belong to the domain of philosophy. And furthermore, that she also, in defining and discussing these terms, she engages in discussions with well-known philosophers. So intertextually speaking, there is a presence in her textual corpus of philosophy, basically. The final part I would like to briefly point to is that she also wrote an article in 1889, Philosophers and Philosophicules, or small thinkers, or small philosophers, you could say. And this is like her take on what philosophy means and what it means to her. Just that she actually even wrote it means that philosophy has a role for her. Otherwise, she would not spend time writing a piece on philosophy. But in this text, she tries to conflate, you could say, theosophy with philosophy in a universal kind of sense. She says philosophy is certainly not a philosophy, simply because it includes every philosophy as every science and religion. But before we prove it once more, it may be pertinent to ask how many of our critics are thoroughly posted about, say, even the true definition of the term coined by Pythagoras. So she continues to entertain this idea that there was once back in history where philosophy was what it truly is, the love of wisdom. And modern philosophy has moved away from this love of wisdom, and she wants to restore this, and she sees her own philosophical project as being kind of a restoration of philosophy as well. This is, of course, highly polemical, but that is often how she wrote. And she enters into discussion about the terms. She engages with discussing and defining philosophy. You can also see here, again, polemically, she writes in the same piece, many optimistic writers would fain make of this mercantile century of ours an age of philosophy and call it its renaissance. We fail to find outside of our society any attempt at philosophical revival unless the word philosophy is made to lose its original meaning. For wherever we turn, we find a cold sneer at true philosophy. So she doesn't like her own time. It's very materialistic, she thinks, and focused on technology. And in some way, philosophy has taken a coloring of that time, and she wants to restore it to more ancient times of a kind of a living wisdom, living practice, and engages polemically in order to try to shift the focus. And again, just in terms of like intertextuality, you can see in her text how she discusses with Francis Bacon and Plato and many of the others. And she's very polemical, saying that, oh, even someone like the father of modern science says that philosophy, when superficially studied, excites doubt. When thoroughly explored, it dispels it. And again, a little philosophy inclined man's mind to atheism, but depth of philosophy brings man's mind about to religion. So she's polemical, bringing in the father of modern science, who says that actually philosophy, when it's superficial, it becomes critical thinking and almost leads to atheism. But when it goes deeper, it moves into the domain of religion and you could say spirituality. And this is, of course, what Blavatsky wants. And she ends this by saying that hence, while philosophers have a legitimate right to the title of philosophers, true lovers of wisdom, and this means that it meant something to her. It was a part of her program and a part of her self-perception, you can say. So, in way of conclusion, I think we need historical unbiased selection criteria for the history of philosophy. This can be accomplished via historical complexity, intertextuality, for example, and multiple identities, understanding the threads that are interwoven in each person, organization, or text. A challenge to the study of esotericism is to be mindful of the historical complexity and not play into the fixed or pre-established identities, such as rejection and othering. This, of course, could open a whole discussion about alternative epistemologies, which is going on at the moment. Blavatsky engages in philosophical topics. Her work is situated in dialogue with philosophers. Blavatsky held original viewpoints about ontology and epistemology. Blavatsky viewed her own project as philosophical and argued for a specific understanding of philosophy in terms of ancient philosophy as a quest for truth and a spiritual way of life, along the lines of the modern figure Pierre Hadot. And finally, Blavatsky should be viewed as a part of the history of philosophy. That's my argument. But also that her identity is not limited to that category. So certainly she was also an occultist. She was also a theosophist. She was also a writer. She wrote fiction as well. So she was a lot of things. But she should, I think, be included in the history of philosophy in an official way, and I can't see really the argument against it. And I think I will leave it there. But thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim. This was so rich, and I definitely advise my students to, watch this at a later date, those who are not here. I have so many questions, but also the audience and why we organize and the audience organizes their thoughts. I have a question for you. This as an ethnographer, I really resonated with your depiction of, or maybe call to honor the complexity of history.
Yeah,
People and traditions can be more than one thing, right? And this is something that
exactly.
I see very clearly, let's say, in my work too. And I was so happy to hear you talk about this in relation also to esotericism and to the study of esotericism. But my mind went through to actually one of the scopes of this series that we were briefly talking about this before the
Yeah,
event, that it's really going beyond dichotomies, embracing the and rather than the either or perspective. And so
yeah.
I was curious whether what's the place of gnosis in
Mm.
Blavatsky's, philosophical experiences, let's say, as a philosopher.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good question. Also, because some of the things I emphasized in the talk was that she almost criticized the concept of consciousness in terms of being limited, and that consciousness is conditioned by time, and that also means that knowledge in that sense is very limited. But of course, in her other work, she emphasizes that reason is not the only faculty of knowledge. It's not actually what occultism and spirituality and philosophy as the love of wisdom is about. That is much more about through self-cultivation, through self-transformation, kind of creating a bridge from the very. She has this very elaborate. You can say diagram almost of the constitution of a human being. So we have a physical body, we have emotions, often called an astral body. We feel things. Then we have rational thought, which is divided into like lower reason, which is very object oriented, that we create concepts that are related to things in the physical world. Then we have abstract thinking, where we can begin to see mathematical forms that don't necessarily relate to anything physical. And then even beyond that, there is this of the spiritual soul or buddhi, which is a capacity to immediately grasp truth, where you don't any longer feel that you're separate from it. It's almost like when Plato talked about remembering what you already know in the soul. So that kind of knowledge where you almost you see it immediately and it's a part of you. So you don't learn it from books, you don't necessarily learn it from experience, but you learn it when you have created a consciousness bridge in your own being to your higher divine soul or higher self, you can say. So there is like an approach to what they regard as true knowledge. You could say gnosis, direct insight, which is to her the living philosophy, not book knowledge, not rational knowledge in this concrete sense, but a knowledge that comes like a flash in the soul where you see directly. And this, of course, aligns very directly with, let's say, Plato's seventh letter, where he even speaks about true knowledge coming as a flash in the soul. And that is something that emerges through dialogue, of course. But in Blavatsky, it also emerges through ethical practice. So ethics becomes kind of a practice that can purify you can purify yourself through ethical practice, good deeds, and other things like that, and meditation, and that will help you be a receptacle for higher knowledge.
That's very interesting. And I bet that maybe in a more secular slash everyday dimension, intuition is
Yeah.
part of the experience of many of us scholars, many philosophers, regardless. But thank you for this clarification. Let's move to the questions. We have only a few minutes. So
Mm.
First, a shout out to Christine, who is an artist and has her studio at the TS headquarters, so where Blavatsky Old Archive is. So shout out. She says hello.
Hello.
And then Foray Brett says that they saw the stamp used for mail. So that's another thing I wanted to mention. And an anonymous attendee asked when Blavatsky wrote papers like one of the one you have shown
Yeah.
before, would she usually sign with H.P. Blavatsky or use her full name? And I think this
Um,
is related to this
that
gender.
that would vary a little bit. She often used also just HPB as her like signature, for example. But she would also sign HP Blavatsky, and she would also do that when she signed books for people. She would send books to people. So it would vary a little bit. But there is a whole, you could say, um, discussion in Theosophy about Blavatsky not just being Blavatsky, but that she also had kind of a more secret spiritual side that would be the HPB
Mhm.
signature side, and then there would be her like persona. Um, so there is something there also.
Um, so Isabel asks, what connection do you see between Ipasha and Blavatsky?
Hmm. Um, I'm not completely sure. I mean, Ipasha, there is of course this kind of drawing up of um, a history of reincarnations, but there's also Ipasha as this spiritual entity, or not completely sure what it's referred to.
Okay, was the last slide. Um, then James
Oh,
asked a number
no,
of questions,
what
and
was it
well,
this slide? The Hypatia, was that what the on my last slide I have
yeah,
a picture of
yes.
Hypatia, the Alexandrian woman philosopher. So I don't know if it was that you asked about.
Well, Isabel asked about this last slide.
Okay, that must be it. Yeah. So, I mean, I just often when a lot could be said about that, but often when women are included in the history of philosophy, Hypatia from Alexandria is included and also included as an ancient philosopher and for one of the first women philosophers. And it's just kind of to poetically put Blavatsky in line, also because they share certain ideas about philosophy.
Wonderful. There are lots of other questions, but we are almost at time. So I encourage maybe the those who ask question or those who have not yet to reach out to me and I can forward the question to Tim because I think it's time to wrap up now. Thank you,
Thank
Tim,
you.
for this stimulating and insightful conversation. And thank you all for having been with us today. Please stay tuned for the activities of the CSWR, the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, and of Gnoseologies. And you can find all this information in the chat box right now, including details about our next Gnoseologies event 1 week from now on December 17th, Arts and Craft Divine. This is the title. Teaching and Learning Spiritual Expertise in Academia and Beyond, a conversation with Olivia Sejan. So see you next week, hopefully. Thank you again, team, for everything, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.